editor at the University of Minnesota Press, where we are profoundly honored to get to publish Jody's beautiful book. I'd like to thank also the Loft and Open Book for having us tonight. I'd especially love to thank you all for being here to celebrate. Thank you to Lindsay and Rose for joining us as well to enliven the conversation. I'm going to keep it brief because the exciting people you want to hear from are sitting over there, but I do just want to say it really is our honor to get to publish this book, and it was an honor for me to get to work with Jody on it. As I'm sure many of you here, animals have touched my life as well. It's kind of appointment week for me to reconnect with this book, and that our darling, sweet old cat we had to say goodbye to earlier. And as I was reminded not only of the joy, I was also reminded of the incredible care and compassion that our veterinarian had given to him over many, many, many years and many, many, many experiences. And that was right up to the very end. And I was reminded again how important that work is when we dedicate so much of our own hearts to these animals, what it means to have people who dedicate so much of their lives to them as well. I believe when I first heard about Jody's book, it was from my dear friend Carolyn Holbrook, who passed along the note that there was this manuscript I should really look at. I'm pretty sure alongside the manuscript, she sent me a video link to Jody reading as a part of the Mentor series right here, probably right where I'm standing. You might remember, you might have read Her Shoes. I don't recall exactly what the piece was. What I do remember was basically closing the door in my office so I could cry by myself for a little bit. It's such a powerful piece, and it also introduced me so immediately to Jody. And even just in that video, seeing the care, seeing the dedication, seeing how much it meant. You know, there's a chapter later in this book called Letting the Light In. I think that reflects so much of the spirit of this book. It reflects what it means sometimes to write, to be willing to go into spaces and share your story in the belief that by letting light in for yourself, even if it takes a long, long time to figure out how to do it, that it lets light in for others too. And that's a really profound form of work, and I think this is the kind of book, I'm sure it meant a lot for Jody to write it. I think it means a lot for people to have it in the world, and for it to be a book to share. I've gone on longer than I wanted, but I hope I've shown you that I really do appreciate this. And so Jody will be introduced a little more fully later. I get to introduce Lindsay Merkel, who is moderating tonight and who will introduce you to Jody even more fully a bit later. Lindsay is Associate Professor of Internal Medicine at the Department of Veterinary Clinical Sciences at the University of Minnesota Veterinary Hospital. She raises and trains service puppies. I also have it on good authority she is a Chihuahua aficionado. I don't know if you get a business card with that title or not, but I'd like to add it to mine. So please do welcome Lindsay Merkel, and again, thank you so much for coming.
Yes, I do have to have somebody work on those business cards. Although some people in this audience might have been bitten by one of the chihuahuas twice today alone, and may not think the aficionado part of it was so good. Anyway, thank you for that introduction. And as many of you know, I dislike public speaking immensely, and there's only one person in this world who could get me to agree to it, and that person is Dr. Jody Lulich, the author of today's book, In the Company of Grace. But before I bring Jody to the podium, I wanted to tell you a bit about this incredible human. I first met Dr. Lulich when I was a veterinary student. I know you can't tell that at looking at me, but more than 30 years ago. A quiet, studious resident and PhD student at the time, Jody was a kind and helpful lecturer. He was known as one of the famous pea people at the college and part of Dr. Osborne's crew. This collective is known worldwide for their veterinary research on all things kidney and urinary. And Jody was an approachable and eager person to help students think through clinical problems. He made it an enjoyable transition from a book-studying student to a patient-focused doctor. Jody was always up for fun and never was afraid to show his fallibility. Over the following decades, Jody and my relationship moved from resident and mentor to internal medicine colleagues. Through the years, I have come to know the depth of Dr. Lulich's compassion and kindness, incredible intellect and inquisitiveness, and his humanity and humility. Jody has used this memoir in the company of grace to show us that no matter what obstacles may be put in your path, and regardless of how they are meant to destroy your will, self-worth, or beliefs, you have the strength within you to persevere. Jody reminds us that people are placed on that journey to help you to survive despite those barriers. Jody credits people like Grace and Joe and Maud and others who are actually in this audience, and I can't wait to meet you all, for helping him to become the person he is today. But the truth is, the person who wrote this book always had that grace within him. It has been reflected in everything he has done and every way he is. The proof of this can be seen in the people he has trained and every person he has touched. Those of us who have been graced with knowing Jody Lulich will be forever grateful that he was placed in our lives. Please join in welcoming Dr. Jody Lulich and congratulating him on this book launch. Accompanying Jody is Minister Rosemary Glass.
Great. First of all, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to see such familiar faces and such a friendly group of people. And thanks for all those introductions. What I'd like to do is introduce you to the book. And the way I'm going to do that is we'll go through a few questions. And so the first thing I want to think about is why write a memoir? Barack Obama wrote Dreams of My Father in search of his identity. Viktor Frankl wrote In Search of Meaning to help people see their life's purpose. I started this book as a tribute to a remarkable woman who changed my life. When I went to veterinary school, I rented a room in a home of a 75-year-old black woman named Grace. She was generous, patient, nurturing, forgiving, and selfless. Every week, when we went grocery shopping, she always picked up items for others in need. When we delivered the items on our way home, they were often an unexpected surprise to the recipient. Now, some would say that our meeting was serendipitous. As I look back, it was destined to be. I walked into the dean's office and started a conversation with his secretary. I told her that I didn't want to live in the dormitory, but I couldn't afford to rent an apartment. She told me about Grace, a woman she lived with when she went to college. She phoned her and arranged for me to meet her that afternoon. I walked the mile through town and up a hill until I arrived at a modest one-story bungalow with green siding and tall pine trees. I rang the doorbell and Grace opened the door. She looked like a grandmother, wire-rimmed glasses, an apron over her dress, a big warm smile. She was welcoming and invited me in. The modest exterior of the house was no match for what was inside. Elegant antique furnishings, a dark wood Chippendale-style secretary, a glass-doored curio cabinet filled with dozens of miniature porcelain shoes. In the dining room was a large Jacobean-style great chair covered in deep red upholstery. On top of the bookcase was a Wedgwood water pitcher with Triton sitting on the spout. Grace noticed that one item in particular caught my eye. On the top of an antique Chinese carved end table was a burled wood box. Grace went over to the box and pulled out a small brass knob. A flywheel hummed, gears turned, tines plunked, and out poured music. Almost comical at first, it had a mechanical quality, like a muted calliope, no rubato, no variation in timbre, and no waver in volume. Then Grace raised the lid. The melody poured over the brim and filled the room, a sweet, harmonious sound, a nostalgic sound, an old lilting tune that reminded me of my mother. As you can imagine, I moved in. In the beginning, Grace and I had a typical landlord-tenant relationship. It was considerate and polite. But all that changed the night she asked me,
Jody, would you braid my hair?
I think you need to turn up your mic. Grace was a proud woman. She was particular about her appearance. She had a routine. Each night before going to bed, she set out her clothes, cleaned and moisturized her face, and pinned up her hair. When she asked me to braid her hair, she looked down at her hands and gave each one a light squeeze with the other. The joints on her fingers were swollen. From the expression on her face and the way she closed her eyes, I could see that she was in pain. Of course, I will braid your hair. Good thing that I went to summer camp as a child and learned how to braid it. I never knew that such a skill would come in handy one day. With that simple act, our relationship changed. As I braided her hair, she would tell me the stories of growing up in the Depression, having her mother move to Alabama just before Grace went to high school, so her grandmother had to finish raising her, and what it was like being a black woman in the time of segregation and the Jim Crow laws of the South. As I braided her hair, she wove her life into mine, and I was in awe.
They want to know if I'm going to my 50th reunion.
Who wants to know?
Cornell University.
As she pushed the invitation in my direction, I opened the letter. Cornell University, that's amazing. She looked up at me, raised her eyebrows and wrinkled her forehead as if I said something terribly wrong. Obviously, there was more to this than just the invitation. Then she slid a manila folder in my direction. Inside was an old newspaper clipping, the Cornell Daily Sun, dated December 18, 1929. Folded on the sides and torn across the bottom, it highlighted a single story. Women's Cosmopolitan Club conducts survey on Negro prejudice in women's dormitories. Grace grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York in the early 1900s. After receiving one of the highest scores on the New York State Standardized High School exam, she received a 4-year scholarship to Cornell University. Grace was thrilled to attend such a prestigious university. But when she arrived, she was not prepared for the social isolation of being black at Cornell.
I had expected to live in the dormitory with other students. To my dismay, Cornell did not permit blacks to live in the dormitory. On my first day, I waited for hours to be escorted to the black community, a little corner of Ithaca. There, I stayed in a house with other female black students. My disappointment could not be covered up.
Grace went to the Dean of Women to protest, only to find out that it was the Dean of Women who constructed the segregation rules and saw that they were upheld. The Dean of Women had a major influence over Cornell's president.
How dare that squat, big-hipped woman in that floppy dress tell me where I did and did not belong? I made it quite clear. To the Dean of Women that someone important would hear about this. I went straight to the president. He informed me that integration had been tried in the past and failed. To make me feel better, he said that there was a quota on Jews. I internally murmured, and a ban on blacks.
Before graduating from Cornell, Grace sought the help of the Women's Cosmopolitan Club. They surveyed the female students in Sage Hall, the women's dormitory. In your hand, on the inside of your program, you have a copy of that original newspaper clipping that Grace held onto all these years. Let me read the part that troubled Grace the most. Those objected to Negroes living in the dormitory on account of sanitary reasons, lower standards of living, social inferiority, intermarriage, and dishonesty.
I was heartbroken. I hoped that my teachers didn't feel the same. I had just as much right to the same education at Cornell as all the rest of them. But some of them did not see it that way. Jody, what do you think? Should I go to my reunion?
I kept quiet. I already knew that Grace had made up her mind. She wasn't setting foot on Cornell's campus anytime soon. Having grown up in the Midwest, I had never experienced the South before. That year, many things were new to me and beyond my wildest imagination. The Southern architecture was stunning and so warm. The kudzu and the way it covered the trees was mythical, like living in a fairy tale. And the food was unique. Not always to my liking, however. But one thing frightened me. In March of 1981, a 19-year-old black man was found hanging from a tree with a noose around his neck in Mobile, Alabama. He had been beaten and his throat slashed. Adjacent to the infamous tree was the home of Benny Jack Hayes, a high-ranking official of the United Klan of America. The police ignored this juxtaposition and assumed a drug deal had gone wrong, and instead arrested 3 men hawking illegal drugs who also lived close. That evening, when I braided Grace's hair, I asked what she thought of the hanging. Do you think those 3 men killed him and hung his body from a tree? The prolonged silence was so thick that I could feel the temperature in the room rise. That was when I realized that this was a modern-day lynching of a black man. The stuff I read about in history books and thought could never happen in my lifetime, but just did. For the next few nights, I braided Grace's hair in almost complete silence. When anything was said, Grace did most of the talking. The stories she's told me left me in awe of her bravery. But what I couldn't stop thinking about was what a fine job her mother had done in raising her.
The first time I came to Tuskegee was to visit my mother in the summer of 1930, right after graduating from college.
Grace's mother moved to Tuskegee in 1922 to teach Braille and reading to black veterans who were blinded and traumatized by the war. She called it bibliotherapy and received appreciation from notables like Eleanor Roosevelt and many others.
For my trip, my mother secured a Pullman train ticket. A Pullman ticket meant that I would have the best accommodations and comforts for the long journey from New York to Alabama. Halfway through the journey, after the train departed from New York or from Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, I asked, like all the other blacks, I was asked to move to the Jim Crow car in the very front behind the locomotive. It was a habit of mine that whenever I experience segregation, to suddenly become deaf. I ignore the conductor's request to move. One should not accept such demeaning arrangements without first providing some difficulty. I was asked to give up my seat again and again. Finally, I acquiesced and got up and made my way, albeit begrudgingly, to the Jim Crow car. I was not happy. Then, one of the steam lines broke in the Jim Crow car. Water was seeping in and the smoke was annoying. I asked the porter if there was another car available. At first, he ignored me. Then, I stood up in the center of the car and began gathering the attention of the other passengers, all of whom were black. I encouraged them to band together and complain to our various NAACP organizations. I shouted, our health was being jeopardized, especially those who had little babies. When the train stopped at the next station, the porter returned and asked me to follow him. I heard about people who were thrown off the train for protesting. I worried that it was now my turn. I worried that something bad, very bad, was about to happen to me. But instead, I was escorted out and onto a brand new Pullman car, all by myself, for the rest of the ride.
What an amazing first year for me. I went home for summer break, but was very eager to return. When I did, Grace had a surprise for me. I walked up the steps to the front door. When she opened the door, I was dumbfounded. No, hoodwinked. Grace had cut her hair short. I thought that our closeness would be ruined. But I'm happy to say I was wrong. Grace and I would spend every night eating dinner together, laughing and sharing stories for the rest of our time together. 4 years of veterinary school went by very quickly. After graduation, I delayed my trip home to help Grace in her recovery from hip surgery, but we both knew that soon I would have to leave. I accepted an internship at the University of Minnesota with an expected arrival date at the end of June. For both of us, time would pass too quickly. It would be extremely difficult for Grace and me to say goodbye, but we tried not to think about it much. On the morning of my departure, I got up early to finish packing. After brushing my teeth and getting dressed, I quietly made my way to the front of the house. I wanted to surprise Grace, but instead, she surprised me. When I looked around the corner at the antique music box, I noticed a large red bow fastened to its lid.
You have to take it with you.
I can't. The music box was your mother's. You enjoy it as much as I do.
In my will, it is yours.
When that time comes, I'll take great care of it.
You have to take it now. It means more to me to see you enjoy it while I am alive, than to know that you will own it after I'm dead. Of all the students who have ever lived in this house with me, I will miss you the most.
I looked at Grace with immense appreciation as tears streamed down my cheeks. After graduation, at Christmas, I came home to spend it with Grace. However, Grace was quickly reaching a stage in her life where she could no longer live independently. Janet, who lived in Tuskegee and was a good friend to Grace and me, helped me move her into a nursing home. Grace was not there long. On April 23rd, 2001, she peacefully died at the age of 90. After her death, her body mysteriously disappeared. I would find out later that she willed her body to the University of Alabama's medical school to teach medical students. After that, She was cremated. That was another surprise for me. I had no idea that her body would be cremated, but when I found out, I went on a hunt to find her ashes. I found them, and when I did, I brought an airline ticket to Ithaca, New York. On a beautiful spring morning, I stood on the front lawn of Sage Hall, a dormitory built in 1875 to house women students attending Cornell University. The building was just as Grace described it. Sitting on top of a grassy knoll was an impressive crimson red brick building with a witch's tower in the center above its entrance. The tower reminded me of Grace's description of the Dean of Women. The tower was capped by a steep, pointed black roof. As I looked up, I imagined Grace feeling sad and unwanted. Grace also described a peaceful, meandering creek behind Sage Hall. I walked around the building and sat down at one of the benches at the edge of the creek. That is where I emptied half of Grace's ashes down the bank, and they tumbled into the water. Suddenly, a strong wind buffeted against my body. Some of Grace's ashes were picked up by the wind, spreading them over the sidewalk and up the street. I should have buried them, I thought. But seeing the ashes rise up in the wind, I knew that they were going to those places that brought Grace both honor and anguish. The next day, I got back on the plane, this time landing in Atlanta, Georgia. I rented a car and drove the rest of the way to Tuskegee, Alabama. I placed Grace's remaining ashes at the base of her grave marker where her mother and stepfather are buried. Before returning to the airport, I drove past the old house on Bibb Street. I looked up at that house and said, what a wonderful time in my life. And I just said, I'll never forget you, Grace. It should be obvious how I came up with the title. My book is divided into 5 parts. Grace takes up the middle section. You know, I've told you a lot about Grace. What I want to do is give you a more complete sense of the book and how it starts and where it's headed. To do that, I want to read the first page of the prologue to set you up for a journey of a lifetime, my lifetime. And then, of course, I'll take questions from the audience. January 14th, 2012. As the lights went down over the audience and up on the stage, my heart raced. And not in a good way. I was one of several veterinarians being honored that evening. I sat in the front row in a dark blue suit, starched white shirt, and blue tie. The room was cold, but I was overheating. My eyeglasses fogged over, I squinted, but could only make out hazy beams of white light fanning down from the ceiling to the stage floor. I shifted my arms away from the sides of my body to dissipate the heat. I took off my glasses and wiped them clean. I turned around and looked behind me. Every seat in the auditorium was filled. Many in the audience knew me, and many of them thought, I knew many in the audience I knew, and many of them thought they knew me. In my hand, I held a single sheet of paper. On one side, I had written the speech I wanted to tell. I became a veterinarian because the doctor who cared for my sick dog was gentle and patient. At a young age, I knew I wanted to be just like him. On the other side, I had written the speech I needed to tell. When I was a little boy, my mother committed suicide. As my father drove to the funeral, a dog darted out from an alley. He ran in our direction. It was an accident, but our car hit him. The crumpling sound as the tires ran over its body jolted me hard against the back of the passenger seat. I squeezed my eyes shut and slowly lowered my head into my hands because I could have prevented all of this. I was torn between my past and the present, between what I was expected to say and how I became the man I am today. I no longer wanted to lie, but ashamed of the truth, I told no one. I turned the paper over and over. Which speech do I tell? I needed to decide soon, before my name was called. In the Company of Grace is my life story. And it's the story of a little boy who, when he loses his mother, goes on a journey to find mothering so that he can grow up into someone who can offer compassion and mothering to others. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. I really appreciate you all coming, but now's the time you get to ask more questions about my book. I've only given you a small section, but if there are other things you want to know, Lindsay Merkel is somewhere around here with a microphone, although you can speak up as well if you don't want to speak into the microphone. How about questions about my book? Really? Any questions?
When did you start writing it?
When did I start writing it? So that's a really interesting question because I started it about 10 years ago. It really took me about 10 years to write. And it really was going to be a book mostly about Grace Hooks at the time, but then when I realized that there were many things in which our lives were together and in many ways that she was shaping what I was doing as I was a veterinarian. So I decided to put them together, but it was a big journey. And I hate to tell you after that, but the year after that, believe it or not, I had this high power agent. And you really have to have a thick skin if you're a writer. I think within the first month, I think I got 35 rejections. And some were nice, and some were okay, and some said, well, it's just not the book for us. But then I finally said, I need to stop for a while, just because I need to sit down and take a breath. And then we'll come back and do this. And that's when I asked Carolyn Holbrook to take a look at it, and she shared it with Eric in the University of Minnesota Press. So that's how that happened. Yes. Besides, this is my Aunt Kathy, and so.
First of all, I have to say I'm so proud of you. So very, very proud. I want to know if you had not gotten the reception that you got at that point in time, would you have continued to fight to get that book published?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So she asked about, so there were times when I hated the book, and times when I liked the book, and times when I hated it again. So it really went back and forth, and I think I would have worked on it, but sometimes you just need to sit in it and rest a while in order to really see where it's going and just let you realize that, it truly is, I really appreciated the book, and I got lots of help, getting it out there and making it work. So I knew I wasn't going to give up. I just knew that time was not the time for me to fight for the book, because I was just demoralized after hearing all those things. And the funny thing, the reason why I got that agent was the same reason how Eric got it. I showed someone my book to read, and they said, Jody, I really like this book. Can I show it to my agent? And I said, sure. So I didn't go finding the agent. Of course, you get online and you try and find agents, and none of them wanted my book when I tried to find an agent. So every time when it really worked, it was serendipity again. It was just putting my book out there and someone looking out for me, and it turned up in the right hands. And I'm so pleased with the University of Minnesota Press because I really didn't know what the cover would look like, and I really liked the cover. I thought it was going to be some silhouette of me and a dog. And so when they showed me the cover, I was really surprised. I think they were happy because they said it was the first time they had a dog on the cover. So they were really happy too. So I was happy as well. How about other questions for me? Yes, there's several.
Speaking of the cover, when I read books, I get very attracted by what's on the cover, and I always wonder why these pictures, why this design. So what about these two pictures? Why did you choose those?
Oh, you're asking the wrong person. I don't know if Eric knows. So Eric said, give me 15 pictures or so. So I gave him 15 pictures. Then he said he didn't like it. The resolution was too small. And then he said he didn't like it because they were all color. Can you make them black and white? So then I had to get Joe's help to do all that stuff. But then they chose it. So I don't know if you, Eric, if you know why they chose those two.
I mean, we work with outside professional designers, but I know in our conversations, there's so much in Jody's story. And obviously with the cover,
Yeah.
it's such a split-second decision for you're looking at a bookshelf and there's 50 books reaching out, and what is it that draws you to that? Certainly a dog helps, but that between Jody and that dog says so much about the heart of what you find in here. And that picture of Grace does the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that it creates a kind of question between all of that.
Yeah.
What is the story here? How do all of these pieces fit into a story about trauma and healing? How do they fit into it? There was a lot to juggle, which is often what happens with beautiful books that contain a lot. So they were great photos.
And I appreciated it, you know, I really did. I was so pleased when you showed me the title. And no one asked about, the cover. No one asked me about the title though. So really, I made up the title, which is really good. Someone had other titles for me, and I didn't know what the University of Minnesota Press was going to do with it. Because what you don't realize is when you hand over your book, they have control over it. They have control over it. And so, but he kept the title, so I was really pleased that you kept the title. Because I
Never would change.
Okay, good. Other questions? There's one over here.
I think it was a wonderful movie. And if they did, who would play you?
So it would have to be a young me. I have no idea. I just hope the person has a good heart and a good soul. I want that to come through. I think it comes through in the book, and that's really what I want to do. But I don't know who would play me. I'm sorry, but thank you for asking. How about other questions for me? Diversity.
Wondering about your thought process on what memories to embrace. I imagine there was many conversations and maybe even more that we didn't hear tonight.
Yeah.
Thinking about Grace going through her own process, going to Cornell as a student, probably gave you some good wisdom and advice. How did you come up with which story should I tell?
Yeah, so that's sort of another thing. It's really a collaboration. So I can tell you the book was much bigger, and then you come up with these themes and where it's going, and stories come out, and you wonder if they should, but they're sort of close to your heart. But if they're not making the whole story, you have to take them out. So believe it or not, there's about 50% of the book that got pulled out, so maybe another one is coming. So I pulled out some of the ones of some of the animal stories to do that. But you're right, what you do is you read it, so a book really happens in revision, and you sort of read it and you see where it's directing you and where it's going, and then you add things or put things or change them around. It's not an easy task. I think the revision took probably 2 years or 3 years as well. So I don't know, it's this magical thing that happens that you sort of put the book all together, and then when you read it all in one piece, you see it really all fits. But I think Joe will tell you there's one story that I said, oh, I wish I had put this story in this book. so there is one story that I thought really would fit in there that I didn't put, and I actually had an opportunity to before it actually went to press, but I think I still kept it out. But it's a difficult process. But what I wanted to do is I wanted this balance. I wanted to show this entire arc, and I wanted the book to be hopeful, and that was really it. So I needed to make sure that it was somewhat balanced with both of those things. So that's how I did it. But it's a really hard question. I don't know, it's an art to it, I think. And you reading it and having other people read it help you through that process. Yes.
So which speech did you give that night?
So for those of you who read the book, you know that I gave the authentic speech. I actually told my story at the end of the thing. But in the one thing that I showed you, which I didn't realize, is Joe took this picture for me. In my hand is really those speeches that I'm trying to make my decision with. I didn't realize it was there until I looked at the picture, that I still have that piece of paper in my hand because I wasn't sure which one I was going to do. It was really interesting when I went there because they give you a little bit of a run through. And so he took me on stage and he said, well, you can say thank you have about 15 seconds and then we'll do the next one. So I never told the announcer or anything what was really going to happen. I just did it so that I could decide at that time. But I did. I gave that one. I It did give the authentic speech. How about other questions for me? Yes.
Was Grace a veterinarian?
Grace was not a veterinarian. So what was interesting is that if you look in her yearbook, and one of the things that I showed you, she really wanted to be a physician, which is amazing to me for not only a woman in 1926, but also a black woman on top of it, because she probably had no role models at all. That's why I said she just had wonderful parents. She ended up being a social worker, though. As you can imagine, still there's that compassion. So even at her old age, because Tuskegee didn't have a hospital, so she would arrange rides, or she would drive them herself to the nearby hospital and wait for them to pick them up and bring them back. She was just that type of person. But she ended up being a social worker. Yes.
Thank you again for all you are and all that you do for Minneapolis. And I feel lucky to be down here at the same time as you. But my question is, Jody, at the very beginning of your book, you say there's a crack in every window so the light gets in by Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
Can you comment on your process of finding a quote that would kind of have an overall meaning for your book?
Yeah, that's sort of another thing. Again, I was looking for hope. Because I think, it's funny because sometimes people read my book and they come by my office and they say, Jody, I just have to give you a hug because the first half of the book or first quarter of the book, they said I had to close the door because I just didn't want anyone to see me crying. And so that was sort of the hope. I guess maybe I should say this. So no one has asked me this yet, but one of my biggest questions is, having written this book and having lived this life, how do I really view this book now? Because that may answer that as well. And the way I think about it is, I think about that our greatest freedom is the ability to choose how we respond to adversity. That it's just so powerful. So after I read that, that's really what I got out of it. And what you need to know is it doesn't have to be right or wrong. It doesn't have to be complete or finished, because you have a whole lifetime to do it. But there are two things it has to be. It has to be thoughtful. Because although we're emotional people, you don't want that hurt emotional child to respond to every incident you have in your life. That just doesn't work. You really want it to be thoughtful. So sometimes you do need to be quiet and sit in it and decide, even though this is how I feel, that may not have been the intent. And then the last thing that you need to do is that it needs to be authentic. It needs to be you. So that's why I had to tell my story. And the reason why it needs to be you is because if you're not you, the world doesn't know who to love. So those are the things sort of I got after doing this whole thing. So the book was a journey for me as well. And I think when I read that quote or heard that quote or things like that, it just made so much sense to me that there's hope in this adversity, but it depends upon how you choose to respond. And that's really what I got from that quote.
Thank you.
Yes?
Jody, thank you again. Was there with the answer you just had, was there as you reflect, a time or an age in your early childhood where you remember or you realize that my life was going to be one of hope and healing?
No. I was a very cynical child. I thought the world was tough. I just thought the world was tough, and you just had to make your way through it. And it was just tough, and you really just had to make your way through it. And you shouldn't expect rewards or gifts or all that. The respect is that you get to make your way through it. But then, I don't know, I had wonderful clients, wonderful mentors, wonderful people like Grace Hooks. Some of you don't know, but I call Carl Osborne my Grace Hooks of Minnesota, because he was really wonderful as well. And I think I was just very lucky. And I think in the first part of the book I said, what I had to realize is, because I really didn't want to be loved, but what I really had to realize is, I need to open my heart and be loved, because then I can respond and learn in that process. But I really didn't want to get close to people, because I thought they just did nothing but hurt you, or you got hurt in the process. And so it takes a while to get above that. So the answer is, it's a slow transformation. Life does change. I mean, I'm very thankful for the people who were in my life, and regardless of what I did, they didn't listen to me or things like that. But when I was young, I was a very cynical child. I hate to say that. That means there's hope for us all. That's really what it means. So yes. Other questions? I thought there was one more. Yes.
Do you have any advice for new veterinarians?
Yeah. So I think the most thing for new veterinarians, what you need to think about is you need to find your why. You need to find your why. You know, why am I here? And then you need to stick with it, even though it can change. But you really need to find, because being a veterinarian is sometimes tough. I mean, when I first was going to be a veterinarian, I thought I would be a pathologist, because I said there's no way I can deal with animals. I didn't think I could deal with the clients and animals die. And then I thought at a university, they're going to die even more often. Because they don't come to us until they're really sick. But I think I tell this story in the book, but that's when Carl Osborne came to me, and he said, Jody, do you want to do an internship? I mean, do you want to do a residency and a PhD? And he said that in the middle of my internship, and I didn't know how famous and how powerful Carl Osborne was at that time. And I told him no. And then he came back a week later, and he asked me that same question again. And you know, just when I was about to say no, he said, Jody, you need to let me know soon, because the University of Minnesota doesn't have a residency and a PhD, and I need time to create. And I said, oh, you need time to create. I said, you must see something in myself, and you must see something in me that I don't see in myself. So I guess what I really say is you need to find out what that why is, and then you can stick with it and get through those bad times. And those good times would be even better. Just finding that why, you know, is it because I want to make it better for animals? Is it because I really want to help clients? It's because I think I can change the way we do this, and animals will live longer and go through less pain. So looking for that why, I think, is really important. And that why could even be teaching the next group of veterinarians coming through. So don't leave that part out as well, because sometimes we don't think we're teachers, but every time we move, act, and respond, we're always a teacher. And sometimes we need to really focus on that, because that'll make the next generation of veterinarians even better. Yes?
So one comment and a question. I also listened to the Angela Davis interview.
Yeah, that was a wonderful interview. I was really impressed with her, and I didn't know what I was getting into when I walked in that radio station.
But what struck me about it, I think, can also be part of an answer to the previous question, is that like a good musician, you listened as much as you talked. You responded to each one of those people who called in and shared.
Yeah.
And that's so valuable.
It is.
So that you're not just teaching out,
It is.
you're really communicating.
Thank you.
On a sort of unrelated note, my question as a writer is, did you do this kind of in a vacuum? I know you talked about sharing the almost finished part with people. Did you have a writer's group? How did you decide who to share it with, who to trust?
Yeah, so I think first when I was writing, it was for my own well-being. It was really me saving my life. And then I had applied to the Loft mentorship, and I had gotten rejected before. So for those people who have applied, you should apply again. But then when they really accepted me, I said, well, wow, this must be, maybe I can accomplish this. So that was the whole thing that really made the difference. So I think I was writing for myself to begin with, and then it sort of switched, and I started writing for others. And that's the same way you need to teach. I think when I first started teaching, I thought people were judging me until, again, Carl pulled me aside and said, you should not be thinking about them judging you. You should be thinking about what you can offer them. And then that writing changed, and everything changed, and it got much better, and I realized that I can do it for them and for me at the same time, and grow in the process. It truly is a journey, though, and so I did get lots of help. Like I said, that mentor thing lasts a whole year. I think Joe probably didn't even know I existed at that time, because I would come home, I would eat dinner, I would practice piano for about 35 to 45 minutes, and I would write, because I knew we met every Friday and Saturday. And it was that's just how it went. And I want to take every advantage of it. But it was a year very worth it. And I think that's when I realized that maybe this is better. And I do have a writers group. Some of my group is sitting up here. And so I have all of those things. You do listen, and they help me. Yes?
Jody, you mentioned there are 5 sections to the book.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see them all together from the beginning?
No, it was, so what about those 5 sections? Well, that's where the University of Minnesota Press came in and helped. Because I did not see 5 sections. And of course, when I showed them my book, they also said you have 2 beginnings and 3 endings. So they were helpful to change that around, and it turned out really well. Because even some people who looked at my book, who were a part of it in the beginning, looked at it and said, well, they really liked the way that came about. So they knew what they were doing, and they treated it with kindness as well. So it was good. Yes, there's several back, and I see Dr. Love out here too. Anyone, go ahead. In back. How about I went back first?
I really appreciated your presentation and like this collaboration. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of how you arrived to presenting your work as is?
Good, thanks very much. Yeah, it took a while when I didn't know what was going to happen, because when the book came out and I knew I was going to do a book launch, I started looking at everybody else's book launch online, and I thought, well, okay, but I didn't stay interested, and they didn't give me enough to really pull me through. So then I started drafting it, and then I thought, okay, I need to ask someone to do Grace's part.
It's like a very high falsetto voice.
It just don't change. And it really morphed, and Rose came over to my house and we practiced, and so she even came over yesterday and we practiced. So I wanted it to give you an opportunity to look into the life of someone that I thought was really wonderful, and also to get an idea of what my book was about. I think Dr. Love had something to ask or comment on.
Thank you, Jody. What writers inspire you?
Oh gosh, there's sort of a lot. So I can tell you a really good book that I liked very recently, if you haven't read it, is Nathan Harris, The Sweetness of Water. It was just a really wonderful book, so I read that one. And then Jody Picoult, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right, and she had I was just surprised she got it right, but what did she say? Small graces or small stories. I'm going to get the title wrong, but she talks about this black nurse who goes in to deliver this baby, and the writer is not black, but she really nailed me feeling how it would feel. And so those are 2 that are at the top of my list. For unusual things, I think Jerry and I share this book. Amor Tolls, is that how you pronounce his name? Who wrote the Nebraska Highway, or Lincoln Highway through Nebraska, and happens, it starts in Chicago or somewhere and goes through, and also The Gentleman in Paris, Moscow, and Rules of Civility. I just love the way he writes. He sort of takes me on this path. So those are some of the ones I really like that are recent. There are lots of other good old ones between Richard Wright and Langston Hughes and all those others too. But for new books, those are ones that I really enjoy. Yes, Justine.
Rumor has it you used to give Old Yeller to vet students to teach about babies, and I was just wondering if you're gonna...
Yeah, so but believe it or not, I still do it, but it's To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird, you're right. And it's funny because at first the university let me use my discretionary funds to buy the students, and then they told me I couldn't do it anymore. So it literally comes out of my pocket. So I spend about $1,000 every year to buy the whole class To Kill a Mockingbird.
Are you going to change it to this book?
No. There's no rabies in here, but they enjoy it. I get them to look at veterinary medicine a little bit differently, and I think it sticks a little bit more than me just telling them, the virus weighs this much, is this wide, and these are the signs. So we have a good time. I think they have a good time too. Actually, I get the students to play the parts in the book. So it really is a wonderful time, and I've enjoyed doing it.
And then, did you decide to become a nephrologist because of Carl's mentorship, or was it related to your mom's death?
Yeah, it was really Carl's mentorship. So it's so funny the way this life takes you through these things. Because really when I was doing research, it was really all with the heart. And so then I thought it was really interesting that here I'm doing this thing, and it's so close to my mother. And then the interesting thing, which Eva's in the audience there, and so is Jen Gregg, we had to divide up Dave Polson's lectures when he retired, which was one of our teachers. And so they all took all the other parts and left me the acute kidney failure. not realizing that I have lived through this part of my life so often that it was very difficult to do. But as I mentioned before, it's important to be authentic. So now after I give my acute kidney failure lecture, I tell my students why this lecture is so important to me. And if you now know what I knew then, you know, maybe my mother wouldn't have died, and your patients won't either. So I think we come away with that with a whole different commitment to being able to save lives. So I do. I don't hide it anymore. But I used to hide it before. In fact, there may be some older veterinarians where I actually gave that lecture out to a bigger audiences before I ever brought it to the University of Minnesota. But no one knew what was going on in my life at the time. I was the only one. But it is. That's why I say it's so interesting that the serendipity that happens, and maybe it's the foibles in your life that you need to correct to make you a better person, or someone up above is directing you to make sure that you learn the things you need to learn through your life. So yeah, very, very interesting, but I had no idea that I would go into that area, but I did end up going there. So it's good. Are we being called to, maybe we'll take one or two more questions and then we need to move out and sign books.
Grace, have children, or did you like reach out to a family?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So Grace did not have any children, and she didn't really have any close relatives. And part of the reason for writing the book is that I thought this was a wonderful person, and there's no way that I wanted her life to pass without people knowing who she was. So that was really part of it. And when I was starting the book, that was the main impetus, was to push those stories further, because I don't think, you know, they wouldn't have heard about her stories. And she has many others in the book as well. So that was it. She treated us, you know, when students lived in her house, she treated us like her kids. One other question, and I think then we need to wrap it up. Oh, two other, maybe I'll let you go and then I'll let you go ahead. Yes, Denise. Say that again? So the answer is yes. I think Eric has gone already, but they are making, there's a contract out, and I don't know if it even goes through my hands, because like I said, once you hand over that book, the publisher, oh, there you are, Eric, you moved your seat. So the answer is yes. They're making the contract now. What I don't know is still once you do the contract, it doesn't mean I get to read it. What I think I'm going to be offered is I will be able to audition to do it. And if they like it, they let me read it. But again, but it's out of their hands too. It's in a whole other publisher. And then you had one more question, Aunt Catherine.
Well, I just wanted to ask you, do you feel that you have inspired some African American men, people, to be veterinarians, because we have few?
Yeah, so the question is, I hope so. Actually, believe it or not, every year I go back to Tuskegee and I teach them their urinary section. So I do that as well. Great. So I really want to thank everyone for coming. Thank everyone who was involved with the book, the presentation. Wonderful seeing such good faces. There's, I think, more food out there, and I'll get an opportunity to sign any of your books if you want to. And if you have to go, you can bring them by my office if you do work at the I've signed some of them already. Do you want to say anything, Lindsay Merkel, to end everything? Or Eric?
I was just going to say, please join me in thanking Jody and Rose and Lindsay and all of you. We can just do a big collective thank you. There are light refreshments out back. Majors and Quinn, our wonderful bookseller partner tonight, still has a couple copies out there. You've framed them pretty nicely.